I love science fiction and strong female heroines, so I was pretty excited at the prospect of watching the movie Lucy, released in 2014, telling the story of a young woman who accidentally ingests a drug that gives her superhuman intellectual capabilities. Right up my alley. This trope isn't new. There are lots of examples in novels and films where the hero or heroine gains access to magical mental powers. And the popularity of this plot point signifies the believability of the myth that we only use 10% of our brain. Lucy goes further than simply enhancing memory or thinking quickly. In the film, the heroine can also read other people's minds, control her response to pain, move objects and people, and ultimately turn into a supercomputer that merges with the universe, scattering her consciousness everywhere. All because the full potential of her brain is unlocked. But while entertaining, the movie left me feeling dissatisfied, because right from the start, there was no effort to base the ideas in neuroscience. It's frustrating because in many ways, it's a lost opportunity. It's alluring to think that we have all this unlocked potential just waiting to be discovered. But in my opinion, the way we already use our brains is even more interesting. Even without fictional brain-enhancing drugs, human beings are impressive. There are those among us who can tell you exactly what day of the week any given date in the past or future falls on, or who remember virtually everything that ever happened to them, or who can recite the number pi to more than 500 decimal places. Undoubtedly, you've met people in your life whose skills or intelligence or wit seem to be a magnitude more advanced than the average person's capabilities. Of all our organs, the brain seems to be the most variable, giving rise to the incredible diversity of our species. So it's no surprise when we're confronted by intellectual feats that appear superhuman, that we buy into the idea that we're all walking around with limitless untapped potential. Anyone who has put their mind to a difficult task or to the development of a complex skill knows the sublime experience of being surprised by what can be accomplished. We might struggle, even most of the time, but we also experience moments when things finally seem to click into place. After a good night's sleep, the pianist finally manages to play the difficult passage flawlessly. The mathematician stumbles upon the solution in a stroke of genius. The actor reveals a moment of truth. And the sense of accomplishment that accompanies that moment is sublime. Watching a child go from being essentially an inert meatloaf to a talkative toddler with opinions in the span of a year or so, one can't help but be amazed by how quickly the brain changes. And what parent hasn't wondered how their child would have turned out if they had given her a completely different set of experiences throughout childhood? William James, known as the father of psychology in the US, wondered exactly that. James had a godson, William James Sidis, named after him, of course, whose father, Boris Sidis, was also a psychiatrist. William James Sidis was a prodigy, apparently reading the New York Times at 18 months and speaking 8 languages, one of which he invented himself by the ripe old age of 8. It's said that in 1909, the 11-year-old boy set the record as the youngest student to enroll at Harvard, earning his BA by age 16. James and Sidis argued that it was his upbringing that helped William James Sidis accomplish so much at such a young age. And they used the boy as supporting evidence for their reserve energy theories, the idea that most people only realize a fraction of their mental potential. William James gave many talks in which he laid out these ideas, and in the 1920s and 30s, self-help gurus began to put a number on that fraction. That's where we think the myth that we only use 10% of our brains was born. There's still some debate, though, as to the origin of the myth, with Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Huzel pointing to the erroneous belief that our glial cells outnumber our neurons 10 to 1 as the source. And then there's John Lorber, a neurologist at the University of Sheffield, who specialized in treating patients with hydrocephalus, or water on the brain, a condition in which the cerebrospinal fluid floods the skull. There's a young student at this university, Lorber once told Science magazine, who has an IQ of 126, has gained a first-class honors degree in mathematics, and is socially completely normal. And yet the boy has virtually no brain. Lorber encountered the student when his physician referred him, just out of curiosity, because his head was slightly larger than normal. Upon scanning his brain, Lorber found that his skull was filled mainly with cerebrospinal fluid, not brain matter. Whereas the rest of us have about 4.5 centimeters of brain tissue between the surface of the cortex and the ventricles, where the cerebrospinal fluid is, Lorber's patient had just a thin layer of about 1 millimeter or so. And Lorber's patient isn't alone. Though hydrocephalus can have terrible consequences for many patients, there is also a substantial literature documenting cases of children with severe hydrocephalus whose IQs are above average. Lorber is quoted as saying, "There must be a tremendous amount of redundancy or spare capacity in the brain, just as there is with kidney and liver." And then there's the 2007 case study describing a 44-year-old French civil service worker who went to the doctor to figure out why his left leg felt a little weak. Brain scans showed that some 90% of his brain was missing. His skull, like Lorber's patient, was filled with fluid, not brain tissue. This man also had hydrocephalus, diagnosed when he was a baby and treated. But then the stent that had been shunting fluid out of his skull was removed when he was 14, and over the course of the next 30 years, the fluid built up again, eroding his brain. But he wasn't noticeably handicapped. His IQ was below average, but not by that much, clocking in at 84. And he had a steady government job, a wife, 2 kids. Along with Lorber's work, the Frenchman's case seems to suggest that we only need a small part of our physical brain to function normally. And certainly, whenever a new case like this is discovered, in which a person goes for a routine brain scan only to find that large chunks of the brain are missing, the media picks up the story. So, what is the rest of the brain for? Are we all housing 90% of unleashed potential in our cranium? Is that where the myth began? The myth is also bolstered by the rare cases of people who find skills they never knew they had after a brain injury. This condition is called acquired savant syndrome and can be truly remarkable. These patients are very rare, but a few days after a concussion or stroke or other brain injury, they realize upon recovery that they're suddenly obsessed with music or visual art. Then there are patients who begin to speak with what sounds like a foreign accent. It's admittedly baffling. For me, the James story seems the most plausible origin of the 10% myth, given the fact that the self-help movement was so quick to pick up on the idea in the early decades of the 20th century. But regardless of where it began, the question is it true? Do we only use 10% of our brain? Or, more specifically, is the difference between the vast majority of average humans and the elite intelligentsia the proportion of brain matter that is put to use? Was Einstein so smart because he was using more than 10% of his brain? To answer this question, like any good scientist, we need to be a bit more precise. Do we mean that at any given time, we're only using 10% of our physical brain with the rest of it lying dormant? Or do we mean that we are only using 10% of our mind's capacity, leaving 90% of our potential untapped? There are subtle but important differences between these two interpretations of the myth. Let's start by examining the first interpretation, a more literal reading of the idea that we only use 10% of our brain matter in our daily lives. Some authors point to the fact that kids can develop, with cognition relatively intact, despite being born with large chunks of brain missing, or that a child can recover from a complete hemispherectomy and be also indistinguishable from his or her peers. So maybe a large part of a normal-sized brain either isn't necessary or it just lies dormant. And there's more mystery. Wilder Penfield, a neurosurgeon who treated patients with epilepsy, discovered that if he stimulated certain parts of the cortex, patients would have very specific experiences. Stimulating the motor cortex would cause them to move a limb, while stimulating the somatosensory cortex would induce a specific sensation of being touched. Stimulating parts of the temporal lobe might cause them to hear music or launch them into a vivid memory. But there are also lots of parts of the brain that he stimulated without any observable reaction from his patients, which made him wonder if, in fact, there are regions of the brain that are underutilized. Then there's the story of one of the most famous patients in neuroscience history, Phineas Gage. Gage worked in railroad construction and suffered a gruesome injury when he was 25. In 1848, he was leading a team of workers who were blasting rock to create room for a train track in Vermont. The procedure involved first boring a hole into the rock, then placing explosive powder and a fuse into the hole, and using a tamping rod to compact the charge. But before using the rod, the workers would place sand in the hole to protect themselves from the blast. That afternoon, it's likely that Gage forgot to put the sand in, or that he didn't put enough of it into the hole. So when he inserted the tamping rod, the explosive ignited and shot the rod back towards him, sending it straight through his face and out the top of his head. The fact that Gage survived at all is remarkable enough. But what's even more remarkable is that he seemed to recover his mental faculties soon after the injury, and the only long-lasting changes that doctors and friends observed were attributed to his personality rather than his mind. Even just minutes after the accident, he was talking to the doctor and explaining to bystanders how his injury came about. 2 months after the accident, Gage traveled home to New Hampshire and soon was helping out again on his family farm. Less than a year later, his mother apparently said that while he had some memory trouble, a stranger wouldn't notice it. 4 years later, his doctor pronounced his recovery complete. How could a person recover from such a massive brain injury if we truly use all our brain matter? But even at the time of Gage's injury, the interpretation of what his case could tell us about brain function was hotly debated. His own physician described him before the injury as hardworking and responsible, and reported that once recovered, his general intelligence and memory seemed intact. He couldn't get his old job back, though, because his behavior was socially inappropriate. As his physician put it, and I quote, "The equilibrium between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed." He was unpredictable, prone to cursing, obstinate, capricious, seeming not to care about others. Gage's case is among the first to suggest that the frontal lobes, where his injury was located, play a role in controlling our animal impulses, and came at a time when scientists were engaged in a debate on whether the brain is modular, with different regions serving different functions, or equipotential, with every part having the potential to take on any function. In the first half of the 19th century, phrenology was a popular subdiscipline of psychology. Phrenologists believed that the brain was divided into modules that were responsible for specific aspects of thoughts, feelings, and other aspects of human personality. So far, so good. Where phrenology ultimately got it wrong, though, was in extrapolating this hypothesis to suggest that a person's mental faculties had distinctive signatures in the shape of the skull. The idea being that stronger aspects of personality would come from enlarged modules of the brain, which could be read by protuberances on the skull. Skull shape doesn't predict brain shape, we now know. But the idea that the brain is modular with specific regions having specific functions remains a fundamental concept in neuroscience today. And modularity received support in the second half of the 19th century with the discovery of patients with circumscribed lesions who lost specific functions. You'll recall, for example, that physicians Paul Broca and Karl Wernicke both observed patients whose language impairments could be traced to damage on very specific regions of the left hemisphere. On the other side of the debate, however, was the idea that the brain, or much of it, is equipotential. That is, brain matter is largely created equally, and the more of it you have, the better your mental faculties. Similarly, the more that is damaged, the worse off you are. Opponents of the modular view of the brain interpreted Gage's story as evidence supporting their position. His mental faculties per se were intact, despite his extensive brain damage. Only his personality changed. Now, you might argue that the literal version of the 10% brain myth is a vestige of this idea, that the brain is equipotential. We have all this unused brain matter that we can just assign to something if we could unlock it. But clearly, we don't need it to function as we already do. And in the 1950s, around the time that the myth was gaining ground, two scientists were undertaking a series of experiments that seemed to prove it right. As a PhD student, Carl Lashley wanted to explore the idea that the brain is modular, but he wasn't too keen on performing surgeries on rats. So he teamed up with Shepard Ivory Franz, whose name graced the front of the building where I did my PhD, to investigate the effects of specific lesions on rodent memory function. Lashley built the mazes to test the rats' memories, while Franz did the surgery, carefully and systematically lesioning different regions of the brain. After a series of experiments, Lashley and Franz concluded that specific lesions did not lead to specific deficits. Rather, it was the sheer amount of lesioned brain that dictated memory performance. The more of the brain that was damaged, the worse the rodents were at finding food in the mazes. And almost a century before these experiments, right around the time of Gage's injury, a French physiologist named Jean-Pierre Flourens was proposing the same conclusion based on his work with pigeons and frogs. Like Franz, Flourens also lesioned specific parts of the brain and found that his pigeon could still fly and eat and mate, and his frog could still learn to avoid an obstacle with only one hemisphere intact. Flourens was clear to distinguish between the cerebral hemispheres and other parts of the nervous system, however. And arguably his greatest contribution to neuroscience was the idea that the spinal cord, the cerebellum, the medulla, and other major brain regions have specific roles. Only the hemispheres, he thought, were equipotential and functioned as one unit. So while we might need all our subcortical structures, the cerebral hemispheres might contain all our untapped potential. By some accounts, the 10% brain myth has its origins in Flourens' work. So what is the evidence that we do, in fact, use more than 10% of our physical brains, including all our cerebral cortex, even when we're just being cognitively lazy and watching TV or zoning out? As we've already learned, our brains are metabolically costly. So there would have to be a pretty good reason for why natural selection would continue to favor such an expensive organ if it was only partly used. And when we look at the activity of our brains at rest, it's clear that signals are zipping back and forth across wide swaths of our brain, and no significant regions are simply quiet. In fact, there's been an explosion of work investigating the brain in its resting state. Typically, neuroimaging is a technique through which we can observe the relative activation of different parts of the brain while a person is engaging in different mental tasks. And sometimes, pictures of the activated brain from neuroimaging studies are taken as evidence for the myth, as they often show hotspots in the brain rather than a hotbed of activity everywhere. But the truth is that these images are just statistical maps from experiments designed to figure out which areas are more active when we're performing some specific task. In other words, imaging statistics specifically filter out baseline neural activity, looking for differences across tasks. But the public often interprets the results that only the one region reported was active during the task, instead of the truth, which is closer to that region was more active during this task than at rest or during a control task, but that the whole brain is pretty much active all of the time. And where you set your statistical threshold matters. If you set it low enough, the entire brain will be lit up or shown to be active. And neuroimaging researchers understood this from the outset, having seen that most of the brain is active when a person is seemingly doing nothing, just sitting in the scanner waiting to be told what to do next. This resting state activation now has its own subdiscipline in neuroimaging, since it can give us insights into many other aspects of brain function. For one thing, resting state activity can show us which parts of the brain act in unison and which parts act alone. And if you look at connectivity maps, images of statistics showing which areas show correlated activation, you'll agree that the brain looks much more like a complicated megacity subway map than a series of isolated islands. And these maps can also show differences in patients with different diseases. For example, with conditions like Alzheimer's disease, depression, schizophrenia, and even healthy aging showing different patterns of connectivity. But the indisputable conclusion from these types of neuroimaging studies is that while we might not understand exactly what it's doing, the entire brain is doing something, even when we're zoning out. Connecting this directly to our 10% myth, we can conclude that our whole brain is actively engaged, even when we're resting our minds. Other evidence comes from patients with damage to the brain. It's virtually impossible to damage the brain to any significant extent without disrupting some aspect of mental life. And yet we still hear stories of children born with only half a brain who seem to function normally, or people who regain function after a large part of their brain is damaged. So what gives? Well, thankfully, the brain does show plasticity, the ability to repair itself, albeit slowly and painfully. And this plasticity is perhaps the biological underpinning of the psychological interpretation of the 10% brain myth, that most of us only reach about 10% of our psychological potential, even as we use 100% of our physical brain. And we need only to look at the lives of babies to see evidence for this notion. The brain is especially malleable during development, as the toddler demonstrates with every new skill he picks up, and as we see from children who recover function after large lesions or even complete hemispherectomies. But this plasticity is limited by biology, and rightly so. Just imagine how devastated you'd be if all of a sudden your brain rewired itself such that you no longer had access to a lifetime of memories and carefully trained skills. Or if you lost the carefully constructed vocabulary that you read so many Dickens novels to build, or the ability to play the piano. Just think of all that wasted practice time. When we think about the brain in numbers, it's hard to imagine that we take advantage of all of its potential. 86 billion neurons with some 100 trillion possible connections is an almost unimaginable amount of potential. And yet, if we don't practice a skill, it begins to degrade quickly. Sure, you might be able to remember some of your high school French when you're in Paris, but anyone who has studied a language extensively has been appalled at the rate at which vocabulary goes out the window without nearly constant practice. These complex skills are laid down in the brain after countless hours of deliberate training because the cortex, which is where much of this information is stored, is a slow learner. Unlike the hippocampus, which rapidly makes associations between co-occurring stimuli, allowing us to lay down new long-term memories, the cortex is much less flexible. Connections, and especially learned associations, are formed when two cells are activated simultaneously. Neuroscientists have a few clever little phrases to help you remember this fact. Cells that fire together, wire together, or cells that fire apart, wire apart, or the ensemble that plays together stays together. When two adjoining cells are firing at the same time, the connections between them are strengthened, and one example of this strengthening is called long-term potentiation. We still don't exactly know how this strengthening works, but we do know that when we learn, there are observable physical changes at the synapse, the space between two communicating neurons. For one thing, the dendrites in the receiving neuron get bushier. Spines grow on them that provide more surface area for the neurotransmitters from the sending neuron to land. And the gates on the dendrites that open and close in response to neurotransmitter binding also change, making it easier for the neurotransmitters and therefore the upstream cell to have an effect. But skills and other types of information are stored in the cortex slowly as repeated actions activate the same ensembles of neurons in similar ways. So it takes a long time to lay down those traces. So biologically, we can't just say that there are easy tricks to help us tap into some deep reservoir of potential. Developing any skill takes time, a lot of time, but most importantly, practice, or experience in any case. Moreover, once the brain is fully formed and well connected, say in early adulthood, every part of it is in use. As we've learned previously, any neuron that finds itself without connections dies. And by adulthood, the real estate in the cortex has all been bought up. The brain is a bit like San Francisco, where there are physical limitations to how much more housing can be built. San Francisco is surrounded by water on 3 sides, and the threat of seismic activity, coupled with strict building rules, limits how tall a building can be. So demand for space is strong and supply is limited. The same goes for your cortex. If you don't use it for a specific ability, whatever you are using it for, be that video gaming or gardening or surfing the net, will be shaping the connections. So some regions are more malleable than others, and some periods in your life are more plastic than others, particularly during childhood when you're learning all the important skills and information that you'll need to function as an adult. That's why it gets harder to learn complex new skills like a language or how to play the violin as we get older. If you pick up the violin at age 18, you're going to have to work much harder and differently to achieve the same level of musical prowess as an 18-year-old who has been playing steadily since age 4. But it's not impossible. It's just very unlikely, since the amount of time and training you'd have to devote to the instrument far exceeds what most adults are willing to do. And this is why we can sometimes see amazing recovery or compensation in patients with large missing chunks of brain. If the damage is slow, the brain has time to reorganize, especially if it's still in the very plastic period of childhood. But acute trauma shows effects even when the damage is to a small area, hence the different outcomes of childhood hydrocephalus and hemispherectomy patients compared with adults who sustain damage from trauma. In the case of hemispherectomies, the hemisphere that is removed was pathological to begin with, and hydrocephalus damage is slow. With acute damage, the brain doesn't have time to reorganize, and the effects are visible immediately. And when we look closely at acquired savants, people who seem to discover new skills after a brain injury, we see that the biggest change is in their obsession with the new domain, which means that even from the first few days, they are spending more mental time thinking about and engaging in the activity, at the cost of doing things that they previously did. Their mindset has changed, their brain is rewiring, but that doesn't mean that they weren't using it all in the first place. While there's no evidence that we leave much of our physical brain idle, there is still some mystery as to how much of our cognitive potential most of us achieve. And that's where individual differences come in. The truth is that your brain is a product of your experiences. What you spend your time doing has a huge effect on its wiring and function. So if you want to devote 20 years of your life to mastering a musical instrument or a video game or a language, you certainly will show great improvement. And in terms of achieving a high potential in these specific skills, you'll almost certainly outstrip most people who have only spent a year or 2 learning them. But time is money, and what you spend it on will limit what else your brain is able to do. So ultimately, the question is not whether we only achieve 10% of our potential, but what compromises we make in terms of all the available experiences we might have during our limited time on Earth.